Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about something that's interesting and changing in the media law landscape, and that's the idea of arresting journalists who aren't traditional journalists and how they should be treated. Now this, of course, is on the heels of the arrest of former CNN anchor Don Lemon, who no longer works for CNN, and he does independent journalism for his own blog work and his own other writings that he does. And the interesting thing is he was arrested for accompanying a mob that protested inside a church, disrupting a church service. The question is whether he was part of the mob or was he just doing journalistic enterprise watching over it. Well, where this is interesting is not the fact that he was arrested, because quite frankly, he's not the only journalist who's ever been arrested, and he probably won't be the last. There have been plenty of journalists who've been arrested over history. Now the question is, well, if journalism is protected by the First Amendment, the right to a free press, what is press? And the problem that we have, and that we typically have in our mindset, and it's been solidified heavily in the courts, is the idea that press is credentialed, employed by news organization journalists. But is that fair? Let's go back in history a little bit to before our country was founded and what constituted the press. Now, there were newspapers. Newspapers existed. But the thing is the concept of newspapers and news organizations is still a very, very, very young thing at this time. The idea, though, of when they say freedom of the press, what do they mean? Because keep in mind, it's a twin sister almost with the freedom of speech that's in the First Amendment. So when you have the freedom of press, let's look at what the colonial model was. Sure, newspapers, easy to understand. But what about the folks who had their own printing press? So freedom of the press, again, you think of the old school. I've got the press that's about this big, and it's got the movable little blocks and type. And then I roll my little ink roller over top of it, put the piece of paper down, and then turn the corkscrew handle to press the paper against the ink-covered blocks, and then pull it apart, and then get my sheet, re-roll it with ink, put the new piece of paper down, corkscrew it down, press, take it off, and there's sheet number 2. And it's not uncommon back in that era that a lot of people had these personal printers. So you would have a situation where somebody would create all these pieces of paper, and it's very much like how we look at social media and citizen journalism today. So you would print out all these pieces of paper. So you just have your one-page leaflet or whatever. Back then they called them either broadsheets or broadsides. And you would have your stack, and you would stand there on the street corner, read Richard's news, and you'd hand them to whoever wanted to listen, or you'd go into the tavern and hand them out. And back then, it's the same as it is today. I would either choose to read it or swipe and delete, just toss it away. I might take it and leave it elsewhere. I might take it and pass it on to someone else, share it, I'd have that kind of situation. And I might even say, this is interesting, and I take something from it and incorporate it into mine. So it's kind of like a retweet, or, where you're taking someone, you're quote tweeting them, and then you're adding to it, that kind of thing. It's not too terribly different than how we handle social media today. That changed whenever newspapers started seeing these smaller individual independent people and basically started buying up the successful ones and then making these larger, monolithic newspapers. So you'd have like a big city that would have several big newspapers, and that solidified the idea of that. And again, people wanted to read the newspapers, not the little brief, the little leaflets any longer. So we start seeing the situation of the growth of what we today think of as corporate media. So then, of course, you go from newspaper and you move into radio. And so with radio, the biggest competition at the time was newspapers. And frankly, one of the problems that they had was that people would read the newspaper over the air. So why would I buy a newspaper when I can listen to someone read it to me? So you can see also almost the laziness of the American consumer coming into that one. But that really put a big hurt on newspapers. So the radio would take care of that. Now, of course, there are lawsuits and radio stations ended up getting their own newsrooms. And then they became a direct competitor then to newspapers. Radio started to become more dominant, as we know, because radio started then becoming smaller and more portable. You start seeing car radios become a thing, and that becomes a major aspect of life. Then here comes television. Why would I listen to someone read the news to me when I can watch someone read the news to me while seeing pictures and video of the actual news? So you can see, why do I need that? Well, all the while this big juggernaut of news gathering becomes a thing, the demand then increases for people who are trained in it. So that's when you see the response of universities saying, we can have a school of journalism or a degree in journalism. And we start pushing that kind of mindset into the public zeitgeist, that it becomes a thing that you should go to a journalism school if you're going to do journalism. So then you get the whole idea of being credentialed. So I have a degree from a journalism school or a degree in journalism from this prestigious university. Therefore, I can now do journalism. And on top of that, I'm now hired by one of these large news organizations. That's like the double credentialing. So not only do I have the degree, but I have the press pass from one of these prestigious companies. So at that point, you can just see the death knell for independent work, because when it's just me versus a newspaper, I can have my leaflet versus your newspaper, and we can maybe tussle over who gets dominance in that. But when it comes down to the idea of fighting against radio, how can me with my leaflet sitting on the street corner compete with radio? And then television comes out. Well, again, me with my leaflet competing with television. And keep in mind, we're used to everyone carrying around their little portable recording device, picture taker, movie recorder in one little unit in our phones. Back then, that's not common. I mean, even as far as 30 years ago, if you wanted to have a good camera, to shoot video with, it might be $10,000, and that's back in 1988 money. I mean, so that's insanely expensive, and so people just can't compete with that. So you can see the death of the independent journalist, and the idea of citizen journalism basically almost gets buried by this corporate news. And of course, the corporate news gets more and more consolidated. So instead of having all of these impressive papers, it's now maybe two big powerhouse papers because they bought up all the small ones, and now you have these huge ones. Or maybe one buys out the other, and now you only have one big newspaper in a town. And that's basically how the news works. And then, of course, with the news, I mean, growing up, you'd have ABC News, CBS News, NBC News. That's basically it, and from there, it's just, well, now what? Along with that, you also see the idea of standards coming into play. So if you're going to work for our news organization, we have certain standards that we think you should follow, and every news organization is different. But for the most part, most news organizations have consolidated, again, we're talking corporate news, have consolidated around major standards such as the Associated Press Style Book, or Reuters in their style guide, or AFP, Agency France Press. So you have all of these major ones that are around the globe that people say, this is the one we're going to follow. Part of it is for simple style. Like, for example, how do you write the word website? Do you write it one word, website? Do you capitalize it? Do you write it two words, web site? Is it capitalized web and then space and then site? And you can imagine that with any word across the entire spectrum of all the words in the dictionary. And if you have 50 writers and they're doing your journalism work, and they're all spelling things the way they think it should be spelled, or phrasing things the way they think it should be, you can see how it'd be chaotic. The one paper wouldn't look cohesive. So they build up style guides. So that's basically the idea of how you end up getting this institutionalized version of what's news. And buried in these style guides is the section on ethics. This is where we start getting to the problem we have now. Again, you look at the idea with ethics, you need to be objective. You need to avoid conflicts of interest. You need to avoid all of these other pitfalls that happen with journalism so we look like a legitimate news organization. And that's an American mindset that news is supposed to be objective. Other countries in the world don't have such a thing. I mean, if you want left-wing news, you turn into this station. If you want right-wing news, you turn into this station. There are some other countries that do look at objective reporting, but for the most part, that's a Western mindset and very much an American mindset. So you have that idea that it has to be objective, it has to be fair, it has to be balanced, all the good fun stuff. Well, people are not objective. They're not fair. They're not balanced. They're humans. They have things they care about, things they don't care about. And even if you don't care about something, that's still showing some kind of bias, because if I don't care, I'm not going to cover it. That's a bias. So you have that kind of situation where, well, what's proper? What's right? Well, here's what the style guide says. If you follow the style guide, you'll be okay. As long as the organization follows the style guideline, as long as the editors keep their people in line. But if you have a biased editor and you end up having a whole bunch of people who, lean a certain way, it's going to change the coverage. So, for example, Beltway media, the network news that's in the Beltway around Washington, D.C., it's 90+%, according to their own surveys, 90+% left-leaning. Well, if they're left-leaning, what do you think they're going to do? The vast majority of Republican coverage is going to be terrible. The vast majority of Democrat coverage is going to be glowing. They'll ignore the stuff that makes their side look bad, and they'll highlight anything that makes the other side, look bad. So it's just one of those things that, that's what works in their system. Now, is it fair? Is it proper? Is it according to style? No, but they're not holding themselves to account. Typically inside a newsroom, a legitimate newsroom, you'd have what's called an ombudsman who reviews the work and says, yes, you're following protocol, but those positions are either cut or they're part of the machine too. So anyway, you move away from traditional media, and thanks to things like the internet, 1993, where it really starts to come into fruition. And then you start moving into the creation of blogs, which really hit their stride in the early 2000s, especially the 2004 election. And you move into all of these different things, like they're focusing on social media. And all of a sudden, the idea of what becomes journalism has shifted. And people used to scoff like crazy, especially in 2004, about bloggers and are they real journalists or not. Well, the big reason why is because, they're not credentialed. They didn't go to a journalism school. They're not working for a prestigious company. Therefore, they're not real journalists. But does that fit history? Again, if you understand colonial journalism, you'd say it's perfectly fine. Anyone can do their own media. It's just a question of, can you compete? And now with social media, you can compete. And you can hear a fire truck out the window and then see there's a fire outside. So you pull out your phone, you start recording, and you upload it to TikTok. Isn't that journalism? I mean, it's a news story. It's relevant. It's sensational, and it's important. It has some level of importance for the people in your area, and of course, it's also localized for that kind of thing. That's news reporting. Now, it's not. It doesn't follow a certain standard. Again, in colonial days, they didn't have standards either. It's whatever you wanted to do because you were an independent. So it's the same kind of thing today. You're following independence of doing whatever you want to do, and it makes it a situation of, am I following what's supposed to be done? Well, what's your rule? So the interesting thing about this is, again, when I was working on my doctoral work, I was doing a study and I was doing some research, and I found a study. This is back in 2007, 2008, and it asked a basic question, and that was, who's more credible, a journalist or a blogger? And I said, well, that's simple. It's the journalist. And I started reading the study, and lo and behold, the majority of people believe that bloggers are more credible. And I went, that doesn't make sense. How does that work? So I was part of that system. I understood, because again, this is mid 2000s. So it's not, Facebook's only 3 years old at this point. So it's not like it's heavy into the social media era. So I'm thinking how did they come up to this? Well, it turns out something very simple. Bloggers will tell you what they believe. So if you're listening to someone who's on the political left, they'll tell you. And now you know. And if someone's on the political right, they'll tell you. And now you know. If someone's a communist, if someone's an anarchist, if someone's a libertarian, they'll tell you, and then you know. Now, if I sit here and say, I'm unbiased, I have no opinion on the matter, I do not show any bias in my news reporting. Look, we know that you're a human. We know that you have biases. We know that it's nearly impossible to suppress biases. Ergo, you're lying. Besides, we have a track history that we've been watching you, and we know you've been lying. You've been speaking favorably about this group and unfavorably about this group for years. We know you're lying. So if you're going to lie to our faces, why should I trust you? Whereas a blogger saying, hey, I'm from the political left. If you want to hear my thoughts, here they are. Or, hey, I'm from the political right. If you want to, hear my thoughts, here's what they are. And we know where you're coming from. And we can agree or we can disagree, but at least you were honest with us. So you can see why that person's more credible. Again, going back to the idea of credibility, authenticity, carrying all this weight. And it's been nothing but hyper amplified moving into this era. In fact, media critic Robert Meyer Burnett said that authenticity is the currency of the future because people are craving authenticity. I mean, AI is a fun thing to play with, but when it comes to the authenticity, people are rejecting it. Like, I don't want it in a lot of places. It's fun if I'm making memes. That's great. If I'm tinkering around making a goofy little video, that's fun too. But I want authenticity when it comes to certain things. And you're seeing that rejection of that. You're seeing the rejection of bloggers and influencers who focus on everything being absolutely perfect, making it look like this perfect production, like it's some like big Hollywood thing for a podcast. And people are like, that just feels manufactured. I want to see you, the real you. And that's one of those things that's actually very refreshing to people when you do show them that. So again, we're seeing this rise of people saying, I can do my own news on social media. It's also along this rise of, hey, these people who are doing their own news on social media, they're more credible to me because they're honest with me. So you can see that being a big thing. Plus, with the phone being our primary source of entertainment, you look at most things that are done, like where are people consuming most media? It's through their phone. It's through social media like YouTube. They're not watching the nightly news. They're not picking up a physical newspaper. They're not even going to websites of the physical, corporate news places. So the corporate news presence is diminishing greatly every year. Physical newspapers are like nearly dead. Newsrooms are nearly dead, because who watches the evening news anymore except baby boomers? That's all that's left. And when they die off, that, medium is going along with it. People want news. They want it right away. They want to hear it from people that they can trust. And again, even if you're being terribly biased, they know you can trust. They can trust you. So where does it get real quick to this idea of like, say, Don Lemon or any other new journalist? Because Don Lemon used to be establishment journalist. Now he's become an independent, and he does blogging and he does Substack writing, and he does, his podcast. So he's in the new media landscape. So, and he's biased. He's very biased, but we all know that he's biased. So, that's part of the whole new media landscape. And again, it's very much like the Colonial model. So you have this idea of him being arrested. Well, can you arrest a journalist? Well, yes. I mean, if a journalist is breaking the law, yes, that's clear. You can't, you don't, just because you're from the press, hey, freedom of the press, that doesn't mean you get to break the law. So the problem is, did he break the law? That's a whole other issue, another argument. But the thing is the idea of, well, he shouldn't have been there with that protest. Well, journalists have followed protests for years. I mean, there's tons of footage throughout history we've seen of protests, throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, where traditional corporate journalists have followed them along and did their thing and marched with them and covered all that footage. Well, again, we've seen time and time again where traditional journalists have a certain standard, and we expect them to act to a certain standard, but what are the rules? It's almost like the Wild West again, because again, we go back to the colonial days, and you think of colonies, you're only the 13 colonies, and the rest of it was just like unknown territory. That's kind of where we are with this social media landscape. And like, okay, so I have a journalist who's doing journalism. He's an independent. He's doing it on podcasts, not on a newspaper. Does this count? So do they get the same protection? Do they get the same, do they get to enjoy all the same rights that someone who has credentials does? Again, go back to the colonial days when the First Amendment was written, and yes, independent journalists are covered. So the Lemon case, the first thing's going to say, did he break the law or not? And then from there, it's going to be an interesting thing to talk about. Like, well, what kind of impact will this have on independent journalists? Because if independent journalists are willing to wade into places that corporate journalists won't bother, there's a need for that, because there are a lot of things that corporate journalists aren't covering. So independent journalists are certainly needed. Citizen journalists are needed. You capturing a little simple news story on your phone and putting it on your TikTok, you're doing journalism. Should you get coverage? And so as this court case unfolds, it's going to be an interesting thing to watch, because who gets protection, who doesn't, that's going to be the story. Not, Dalton Lemon or who Don Lemon is. It's what's going to happen to independent citizen journalism in new media moving forward. So keep an eye on that, and we'll see how it unfolds, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more here. But that's it for now. Thank you very much for listening. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for hanging around this long, and I hope to catch you next time on Communicology.